Hello and welcome everyone to Something Else, a podcast of Afro-Indigenous perspectives on everything you never asked for those opinions about. This is our inaugural episode, kind of our pilot episode, so to speak, and this is the introduction to that episode. So I'm going to admit right up front that if you're the kind of person that reads recipes, for example, and there's always that long intro at the beginning that's, I had my study abroad at this lovely villa in Tuscany, and we came across the most lovely trattoria where the chef made these blah, 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 blah. You can skip over this intro if you like and just go right to the meat. You're not going to hurt my feelings at all if you do that. I understand. But if you are interested in the how and the why this podcast came to be and what we're going to talk about in this episode and other episodes, then stick around and let's talk for just a minute. So first, the podcast came about as a practical matter. I'm in the middle of writing a book, which, if you're listening to this podcast, then chances are you are subscribed to our Patreon and you have access to that book. It was taking too long to write the book. It takes a long time to write down good, compelling prose and get over writer's block and deal with the opposite of writer's block, where you're just like vomiting all this stuff onto the page and it's not particularly well written or very good at all, really, and you have to spend all this time doing edits and rewrites and more rewrites on top of those rewrites, and it was just taking too long. I'm a little bit better, I think, in some ways, speaking more extemporaneously, following that indigenous oral tradition of mine where we just tend to like to talk, whereas writing is a more polished and finished type medium where that's not really where I come from. So just for the heck of it, I decided to do the next volume of my book, which was supposed to be, I think, volume 3, chapter 4, or something like that. Figured, what if we recorded that instead of trying to do it as finished prose, like a 15 to 20 page chapter? And it turns out I was able to record in about 3 or 4 hours what normally would have taken me almost an entire month to get done. So this, at first blush, at least kind of feels like a winner. The other thing is that the format of a book is just so constraining in a space where there's just so much to talk about. When you've got food and foodways and the culture around food and decolonization and indigenous society and trying to meld indigenous principles with leftist principles with a way forward beyond capitalism, and then discussions of capitalism itself, and is capitalism really bad, or is it just the applications of capitalism, and does leftism and progressivism, anarchism, communism, socialism, all the isms, do these have their own problems, and are we really just kind of grasping at shadows when we're trying to figure out, is one necessarily better than the other? And there's the business of farming, the business of agriculture. There's all these things we talk about in terms of bringing new fields of farmers and agroforesters and ranchers and food people and food folks into these collectives and redoing the way that we do agriculture and food distribution and how we grow food and how we relate to food. And when you think about all these topics, and these are just the ones that I'm literally able to think of off the top of my head, it would take several lifetimes to get all that down on paper in a kind of marketable form of prose. It's a lot easier to just kind of sit here and talk to people. So that's pretty much the long and the short of it. I was doing a book, and the book is just a little too constraining, so we're going to try a different medium. The whole reason we did the whole Untitled, which is the name of the book, it was called a living book because we didn't know where the book was going to go and how it was going to grow and how big or how small it was going to be and what we were going to talk about. So this is kind of the next evolution in that. Is kind of a hard thing for people to tell their friends and families about, so we're just going to narrow it down to the Something Else podcast. And if you're not familiar with why it would be called the Something Else podcast, there was a famous incident with CNN where they did some kind of survey of different racial groups and wound up somehow categorizing anyone who wasn't African American or Asian or Latinx or white as something else, which basically left indigenous people. So we just kind of ran with it, and it became a big thing on Indian Twitter to refer to ourselves as something else, kind of tongue-in-cheek to the fact that we're living in plain sight, but no one really knows who we are or really acknowledges our existence in a lot of cases. So this is a play on that, and as we said at the top, Something Else is a podcast about Black and Indigenous perspectives on things that people have never asked for those perspectives on. And it's going to be a lot of different things. We'll find ourselves discussing politics, gender, food, agriculture, technology, economics, finance, family, children, elders, justice, language, history, comedy, sexuality, fashion, climate change, ecology. And for this inaugural episode, we're going to delve a little bit into decolonization. Specifically, the relationship between decolonization and leftist movements around restorative justice and transformative justice. And let me just issue a quick warning about not only this pilot podcast, but also more than likely all the other episodes that are going to follow. This is not a cheerleading section for leftism. This is a podcast about improving ourselves, about doing better, about looking inward, about understanding who we are so that we're able to affect better outcomes out in the world. This is not a place to come to feel better about things that you consider to be the truth or things you consider to be good. This is not a place to have your values and ideas around all the things that I just talked about: politics, gender, food, agriculture, technology, economics, etc. This is not a place to feel better about those things and to feel like you were right all along. This is a place where we challenge everything. This is kind of a Heyoka podcast where we criticize anything. Nothing is sacred. And we do it with an eye not towards being sensationalist and pissing people off and just generating ratings, but because the purpose, not only of this podcast, but of my work in general, is to effect real change, to change people's minds, to actually wield that definition of power, the ability to actually influence people and get them to think and understand things a little better. So I'll apologize in advance for the fact that this is not a place where you come to hear "you are okay." With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Something Else, Episode 1, Killing the Noble Savage. Only when the last tree has died, and the last river has been poisoned, and the last fish caught, will we realize we cannot eat money. Depending on who you ask, this is either a quote by Squamish headman Seattle, or it is a Cree Indian proverb. Whichever it is a grim prophecy for the European invader that their system of living and their way of relating to the world and to one another is destined to consume everything until they are left with a pile of money that is absolutely worthless. If the attribution of this quote to Seattle is accurate, then it is over 150 years old. And you might say today that with our undeniable descent into the consequences of things like climate change and mass extinctions and the death of languages, and more things than I want to count in order to keep everyone in at least some sort of a hopeful and upbeat mood, it's easy to say that we are on the doorstep of that prophecy. Now, I don't want people to believe that this is some kind of doom and gloom screed about the end of the world and some polemic about who you should be mad at and who you should blame for all of the things that are happening. Armageddon has happened before. It just probably hasn't happened to you if you're not indigenous or if you're not black or if you're not from one of the other set upon cultures from all around the world that have been subject to victimization by European colonization. But if you're a typical white person, then this is probably your first experience gazing into the maw of the end of your society and culture as you know it. But that doesn't mean the end of all society. It doesn't mean the end of all culture. All societies at some point or another have had to endure shocks and upheavals, and in some cases, complete resets. And whatever it is that's coming is going to be another one of those, of which there are plenty of historical precedents, and people come through it. My ancestors came through it. My own existence is the result of people having come through it, and surviving and adapting and moving on with life with all of its garish imperfections. But then there's also this possibility. What if we're all just overreacting a little bit? After all, people have been predicting the end of time since there have been human beings, ever since the sun first set over the horizon, and people kind of wondered, oh my God, is it coming back? People predicted the end of the world, especially in Europe during, say, the Black Plague. They predicted again with World War I, with World War II, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've always thought that the end is nigh and we'd better repent. But we've been wrong every single time. No matter how certain they were, and no matter how precise they were about the when and the where and the how and the why of the end of the world. So maybe things aren't quite as bad as we think they are. Perhaps instead of looking at the end of civilization or society as we know it, maybe we're just looking at the end of certain things with which we've become, if not necessarily comfortable, then maybe we could call it familiar. The end of things like broad-based prosperity, as it's so often called by proponents of Western civilization. That idea that at least most people in industrialized nations aren't starving and aren't living hand to mouth, and they're not living with the kind of scratchy existence that you supposedly might have found before Western civilization, even though there's lots of evidence that the opposite of that is true. Nevertheless, that construct of modern broad-based prosperity, maybe we're at the end of that. Maybe we're at the end of social mobility or a large middle class. And maybe we're just at the end, specifically for us in this country, in the United States, maybe we're looking at the end of the American dream as we knew it. And maybe we're afraid that that American dream is going to be replaced by something that we've had before, like a Gilded Age, where you had unapologetic wealth and income inequality, and you had the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Mellons and people like that just running the whole world and doing whatever they wanted, and those kind of conditions led to things like World War I and World War II, where we really did think that the end of the world was coming, where we developed these weapons that could annihilate entire cities, and we finally got to the point where we realized we could, at least in theory, if not in practice, actually destroy the world. That world destruction hasn't actually happened, no matter how close we've gotten, no matter how much we flirted with the brink of annihilation. But nevertheless, we're afraid, I think, of going back to that time. A time when an incredibly small number of people control an incredibly large amount of resources and wealth, and you have these incredible technological and industrial advancements that supposedly elevate the overall well-being of the society, existing simultaneously with unbelievable poverty and suffering and misery. In short, I think we're afraid of living in a kind of Star Wars universe. Star Wars is really interesting fiction in the sense that you have this fantastical level of technology existing side by side with flaws in humanity that we would find very recognizable today. You have lightsabers, but you also have slavery. You have the ability to travel from one side of the galaxy to another, not only within a person's lifetime, but from what we can tell, just in a matter of hours or minutes, which also exists side by side with galactic scale organized crime and gangsters. You have prosthetic limbs that can wire into your brain. So, Luke Skywalker has a fake hand where he can actually feel the needles pricking his fingertips after he loses his hand to his own father. And at the same time, you also have genetic engineering and clone armies and all kinds of things that are just beyond ethically dubious, that are just wrong and used for naked grabs of power at a galactic scale. We can identify with that kind of evil, even as it sits side by side with scientific fantasy. And as we, the normal people, sit here and watch Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson launch themselves into space, and Elon Musk create self-driving cars that are supposedly for the masses, and we watch billionaires and multi-millionaires invest in things like lab-grown meat and growing all of our produce inside so we're not dependent on the sun or on the soil, and we really kind of take all the democracy out of even basic things like food production, forget about advanced things like electric self-driving cars. It can feel an awful lot like we are tumbling towards that simultaneously utopic and dystopic Star Wars kind of universe, where in spite of all the wondrous creations of humanity, when it comes down to the you and me level, it is every man, woman, child, and alien for themselves. And if you were to ask me where I think society is headed, I think we're headed toward that Star Wars universe. I don't think we're headed towards that end of the world scenario where we've drank all the rivers dry and there's no natural resources left at all. I think we may be coming towards a point of scarcity where wealth is going to look different than it does now and power is going to look different than it does now. But fundamentally, I think we're going to see wealth and power, whatever they are, calcify around the people who already have it. And for those of us who have a little bit of it, we're going to find ourselves simply having less and less of it and having less and less control over our lives and our destinies. I don't really believe we're going to have this kind of revolutionary cataclysm that really upends who has power and who is able to control society and who forms the culture and what we value and what we prioritize, because that simply doesn't match with historical precedent. There have been lots of, like we said, upheavals and revolutions and things like that throughout world history, but they rarely benefit the rank and file people. That's not really how revolutions work. Revolutions tend to be more like the American Revolution, where it's one group of privileged rich people fighting against another richer and more powerful group of rich people. But in the end, the rest of us who were just, the farmers and the mechanics and the working class, we kind of just watch it happen, except when we're actually being thrown into the machine of revolution, but not as its conductors or its operators, but more like fuel. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that if you're listening to this podcast, you are more than likely sitting pretty far on the left of the political spectrum. You're not a neoliberal. You're probably beyond even being a socialist or a communist. You're probably somewhere in the indigenous decolonization anarchist kind of camp. And if you're in that camp, you have a number of goals, one of which is to prevent that first Armageddon scenario where there is no more water to drink and there is no more food to eat. This is why we have water protectors and land protectors trying to prevent pipelines and other man-made disasters from destroying what natural resources there are left. But the goal is also, in the event that things keep going in the direction that they are going, to prevent society from winding up in that Star Wars scenario, where power calcifies around the already powerful, and we live with the dissonance of incredible technology living side by side with enormous failures in the human condition. Decolonization movements have an incredibly difficult task of at once performing activism and direct action to arrest the current trajectory of society, while simultaneously creating new systems and structures and cultures for ensuring equity in both opportunity and outcome, and making sure that we have a culture that values caring for one another as people, rather than just competing with one another to get ours and hoping that everything just kind of works out in the wash. To do this, we tend to draw inspiration from indigenous societies. That's the whole reason we call the movement a decolonizing movement, because we're going to tap into ancestral knowledge and wisdom to decide how do we create an economy and a society and a culture that prioritizes people's well-being and proactively pursues that well-being. And my experience, unfortunately, has been that instead of really taking a good look at how these societies architected themselves and interacted with one another, and how individuals and groups within those societies navigated the daily hurdles of life and the challenges of dealing with nature and humanity, etc., a lot of people, to the point of saying that this is the dominant way that decolonization is presented, is simply the opposite of whatever capitalism and the dominant society is doing. And instead of having a movement full of people who know themselves and know what they want to be through deep learning and understanding of the societies and cultures from which they're drawing inspiration, you instead just have this incredibly reactionary movement where people don't know so much what they want to be, they just have a pretty good idea of what they don't want to be. And otherwise, they're just kind of grasping at shadows. You see this, for example, in the alternative food movement, which has all kinds of weird and awkward intersections with decolonization and the mainstream food movement and the organic movement and all the privilege and complication that goes along with all that. But you see, for example, that agriculture as we know it today is big, and therefore the solution must be small agriculture, small farms. Big agriculture is integrated, so alternative agriculture has to be extremely specialized. Big agriculture is focused on commodities and markets, and so small farms should be completely unconcerned with money and markets and should be all about community and sustain themselves who knows how. Big agriculture is global, so sustainable alternative agriculture should be hyper-local, where you're only eating out of your local food shed, ideally. And all the while, if someone were to just look a little to the left and look into the history of indigenous agriculture, which really was sustainable for the most part, especially in my neck of the woods where my people come from, in the eastern woodlands, agriculture was not small. Agriculture was, in many ways, integrated. There was hemispheric trade, where corn from here could have found itself all the way in present-day New Mexico or California. Who knows? And the point of this isn't to go on some long rant about the food system. In fact, this podcast isn't really even about food. This is more about movements. But the alternative agriculture movement, which in some ways the decolonization movement has kind of glommed onto a bit, is demonstrative of how, as a movement, we have, despite our professed inspiration by indigenous people, failed to actually look at what indigenous people were doing. And as we're going to talk about in this podcast, and which is going to be kind of the meat of this podcast, we're going to understand what the costs are of doing that. Obviously, re-indigenizing the society, especially here in the United States, is going to be a pretty tall task, and it's going to have lots of challenges. And we like to frame those challenges mostly as external challenges. We talk about how wealthy people, or the police, or markets and capitalism and big business and big corporations, etc., how they're kind of our primary challengers, and we face them under the assumption that they're the ones we have to overcome in order to get where we're going. We tend not to look inward and introspectively and realize that at this relatively nascent stage of decolonization, we are our own worst enemy. We don't have our house, our people in the kind of order that will be necessary to mount a real challenge against a dominant society that has had an awful lot of time to prepare and is very much ready to resist change. If you ever find yourself listening to especially hard-right conservative media, which I do all the time, I used to listen to people like Rush Limbaugh and Family Values Radio or whatever the heck it was, just to see what the heck they were talking about. I recommend that you do it if you don't, because it's fascinating listening. You're not going to agree with any of it, but it's fascinating to kind of look behind enemy lines and see what they're talking about and what they're on. But one of the big things that they talk about over and over again, and one of the things that I tend to agree with, surprisingly enough, is that the left always eats itself eventually. They say we have this habit of whenever anyone on the left rises to any kind of prominence and gets any kind of traction, we tend to look for the lie. We try to figure out that they all along weren't being authentic. They were really just in it for themselves. It's very much a crabs in the barrel mentality where when anyone makes it anywhere near the lip of that barrel, it's time to pull them right back down into it. And where on the far right you see them winning elections and redrawing congressional districts and getting Donald Trump elected president of the United States and getting all kinds of seats on federal courts and going all the way back into the early 19th century with abortion law in Texas. On the left, what do we have? We have meme accounts and watch lists. There's no decolonial representation in Congress or in the courts or in the executive. And it's fair to say that the point of decolonization is not to participate in those colonizer methods of running things, but as a practical matter, especially in the short term, wouldn't it be nice to have someone in those places to kind of eat at it from the inside? But even from the outside, we're not doing particularly well. Solidarity economies are mired in their own politics and are having trouble even getting past the planning phases. I've got lots of people who've talked about direct action type things they've tried to do where people couldn't even agree on where to park. Mutual aid networks are doing the best they can, and in fact I participate in those networks, but they're relatively unorganized. They are relatively underfunded and under-resourced, especially compared, again, to the fact that our opponents, ranging from, say, the center-left all the way to the far right, have captured all the levers that control all resources at scale. Why do leftist movements, whether they're socialist or communist, or whether they're decolonist or anarchist or whatever, why do they always seem to fall apart before they're able to get any traction and get large and start actually impacting people's lives? Why do they have this American chestnut problem? You know about the American chestnut, where this is a hardwood forest species that used to dominate the forest in the eastern woodlands and going up into the Great Lakes region. It was probably one of the dominant tree species in the United States, and these things got absolutely humongous, and they were a big part of the native economies in the area. But a blight was introduced from overseas where all of the mature chestnuts effectively died, and now American chestnuts really can't get big. They'll grow up to a sapling, but eventually the blight will take over and the trees, their development will be arrested, and eventually they'll die. They just can't get to the size that they used to be and demonstrate their natural majesty and usefulness to the soil and the forest and all the relations that dwell within, etc. It just doesn't happen anymore. For some reason, leftism, decolonization, all of it in this country has an American chestnut problem. And instead of digging deep to try to figure out what's going on, why is this happening, why are we not growing into something that can really affect the human ecosystem around us, we've done something fairly extraordinary. We've done kind of what the farm-to-table movement has done, where since we can't seem to get big, we're going to do the easiest thing, which is to say that smallness is a virtue. It's a feature, not a bug. Well, how convenient is that? We've turned the fact that we can't win into winning itself. Well, in this podcast, we're going to assume that we do want to win. And that to win, we're going to have to do a little introspection and understanding, and looking around corners and behind things where things maybe aren't as savory as we'd like them to be, or as we imagine them to be. If you ask people who have been disillusioned by leftist movements, and there's lots of them, if not arguably most of them, which is why we don't gain popular traction to begin with, they would tell you right away that the theories behind everything from socialism to decolonization are perfectly fine. The problem is the people. And of course that's right. It's that old saying that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. And in this case, and especially in our situation, the enemy is often us. It's people within the movement who can be abusive and selfish and are in it really for themselves and not so much for gaining equity and liberation for other people, but rather there's an opportunity to gain material wealth or social stature or both that they're not able to get within the dominant society, which has far more strict rules and where selfishness and toxic behavior are certainly rewarded. I mean, look at just about any Fortune 500 CEO or any C-suite executive at all within those companies. But you've also got to bring some privilege. You've maybe got to work hard. You've maybe got to go into an awful lot of debt or get education that isn't necessarily accessible to you. But leftist movements don't have those barriers. And furthermore, these leftist movements are reacting against capitalism and are extremely accommodating to the kind of selfish and toxic behavior that can often hold back a group, especially when you look at certain parts of leftist movements, say Restorative Justice, which likes to argue that people's individual faults and individual bad behaviors have community causes. And so when somebody acts up and does something selfish or does something insane, then the community really needs to step back and look at itself and decide what are the conditions that we created to make this person act the way that they did. And interestingly enough, a lot of this tolerance for that kind of behavior is framed as decolonizing. But is it? There's this notion that people don't necessarily say out loud, but it's very much implied in how we assign causes to abusive behavior and non-productive behavior, that greed and avarice and all these other negative human inclinations are not something that comes from within a person, but they're just the result of the trauma of colonial capitalism. That people act in a greedy way because they are afraid that things are going to be scarce, and the reason that they believe in scarcity is because they've been brainwashed by capitalism, which convinces people to compete against one another for a finite pool of resources. But isn't what we're doing there just wrapping a narrative around an outcome that supports our ideas for why that outcome happens? Is it really something we're observing? It's kind of like that statistic that's used to demonstrate the difference between correlation and causation. You know, the whole idea that when ice cream consumption goes up, more people drown. And some people might take from that, well, somehow ice cream is causing people to drown. But the reality is that people eat ice cream when it's hot, and when it's hot, people also tend to go swimming, and when more people go swimming, then people drown. But if you're just looking at those two little things, you could certainly try to create an argument that somehow ice cream is killing people. Decolonization frameworks, as they're popularly imagined now, operate in a kind of similar vein. Abusive behavior on the part of individuals, even that harms the entire group and its ability to exist in harmony and to progress, is considered the fault of capitalism, and so we treat it very, very gently. We see that reactionism. Capitalism throws away people who are abusive or selfish unless they're able to create a whole lot of money. And so decolonization is going to do the opposite of that, and we're going to coddle these people and try to nurse them back to health. And if it slows down the progress and the well-being of the entire group, well, so be it. Unless, of course, that person, as we discussed before, has achieved some kind of momentum and has developed some amount of power, then at that point, decolonization, leftism, etc., they tend to pull out the pitchforks and the torches. It's time to bring this person down. There's hardly even any investigation. You get one side of a story that this powerful person did something evil, and you assume that this is going to be the next capitalist and we have to destroy them right now, and that's exactly what happens. But for this individual without that power or without that clout or whatever you want to call it, we're going to go slow with this person. We're going to really examine things, and we're going to allow them to continue to exist in our ecosystem, potentially causing damage and doing what they're doing, since their abusive behavior is effectively being not only validated, but called not their fault. And we're going to call that a transformational, restorative, or decolonial outcome. But what if, like we said before, we kind of took a little look to the left at how indigenous people dealt with toxic behavior from people who threatened the survival and well-being of the group? Because inside this notion that selfish, greedy, avaricious behavior is the child of capitalism, there's this implication that indigenous people, prior to colonization, didn't have to deal with bad actors, that everyone was just good. But is that true? Can that be true in indigenous societies, for example, that have languages sporting lots of different words for lazy people, greedy people, words that predate white people showing up in our country? These words were invented to describe something that existed. And I dare say that notions that it did not exist are instances of noble savage mythology being applied to us by people who supposedly know better. But moving from the space of myth into reality, we see that indigenous people had some fairly robust, and some might even say violent and severe methods for dealing with people whose behavior and actions threatened everyone's well-being. You could look at oral traditions coming from my own tribe, with elder women having the ability to unmake chiefs and make them, as we say, fall down, which is a euphemism for having people killed. Or you can look further north at the Haudenosaunee and their Great Law, which goes into great detail about how to handle everyone from bad individuals to bad chiefs. But those are just, oral traditions on the one hand, and, the Great Law theory on the other hand. People violate their own laws and theories all the time, so who are we to know that these things actually happen, that enforcement and quote-unquote policing of behavior for the benefit of the group actually happened? Is there any first-hand account of these types of justice being meted out? And of course, there are. There's lots of examples, and there's one that I'm going to focus on in particular because it happens relatively early in the invasion of the American West, and it's written by a white person, and there's several grains of salt that we're going to talk about you need to take with this person's account. But it's an eyewitness account of how indigenous people dealt with someone who decided they were going to take more than their share. And there's a couple reasons why we have to view this account with a hint of skepticism, to say the very least. One of them being that this writer is recording their observations in the mid-19th century, at a time when the Upper Missouri tribes, which is who this writer is writing about, they have contact with white people, but they don't have extensive contact with white people. But nevertheless, it is very likely that they are dealing with the effects of epidemic disease, which, as we know, raced well ahead of where the invaders were, because the invaders would come and they would make contact with a town, and then people in that town would go deeper into the American interior to do their trading and all the other global kind of economic things that they did that we tend to overlook a little bit, and they would carry diseases with them. And so you would have societies that had never laid eyes on Europeans that nonetheless would be dealing with European diseases and all the fallout therefrom, which could include death rates as high as 90%. So when we're reading this person's account, we have to keep in mind that these are societies not necessarily operating at their apogee, and that are perhaps living a bit more hand-to-mouth than they are accustomed to, and where the group is more vulnerable than it is accustomed to being because there are simply fewer people. And because of that vulnerability, perhaps they have to deal with bad actors a bit more severely than they would have during the fat times. The other grain of salt we have to take is, again, stemming from the fact that this writer is describing something in the mid-19th century. White people writing about what was going on with the quote-unquote savages out west, they had an agenda. These weren't impartial accounts written by Walter Cronkite types with journalistic integrity and that sort of thing. These were people who were trying to paint a picture. They were trying to paint something that would sell well in Eastern newspapers and that would get eyeballs and get looks and whatever the 19th century equivalent of clicks and likes were. So these guys had a vested interest in not so much painting a full and robust picture of the truth, but more taking a skeleton of truth and then hanging a fleshy, compelling narrative around it where once that flesh was complete, you didn't necessarily see the truth, but at least the story that you saw was based on a true story. We also have to consider that this quote was published in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology in the summer of 1937 under the title Police and Punishment Among Native Americans of the Plains. This was part of a thing that white people often do, which is try to understand indigenous societies by creating parallels with their own. And so in this, they refer to people who were enforcing the social codes and other kind of standards of society within the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and various other Plains tribes. They were trying to describe them as police so that white readers could understand. So when you're listening to this quote and what this person has to say, just make sure you keep a filter in your brain for just the facts and do a lot of work to try to tease out what is opinion and sensation and what is maybe an analysis versus what are the hard facts. So here goes the quote. When the bison are finally surrounded and attacked, the hunt police supervise to see that the rules regarding the division of the meat are observed and to settle all disputes concerning this. Of punishment by the police of infringement of the law regarding the hunt among the Upper Missouri tribes, our observer of ante 1854 observes, quote, "Should any person or persons violate these laws, after the decrees of the Axita Lodge have been published, the Axita meet him on his return home, take his meat, kill his dogs or horses, cut his hides up, cut his tents to pieces, break his gun and bow, etc. If the individual resists or attempts to revenge any of these things, he is shot down on the spot by the Axita, or struck down by a tomahawk and pounded to death. Occasionally, they are thrashed with bows, in addition to the breaking of the gun, etc. The writer has seen 2 killed, and many severely thrashed for this misdemeanor. The consequences of destroying the hunts are serious to the whole camp, hence the violent penalty, and examples are made occasionally which serve to increase the respect and fear of the Axita as a body, and enables that business to proceed with order. In this, the Axita are supported by the whole camp. and it is on them as a body that decisions are invested with binding force, if force be necessary." End quote. Now, as we said, there are some things that are problematic about this description. Things that maybe seem a little on the sensational side. For example, the readiness with which a culture that depends overwhelmingly on the horse, the idea that they would kill this person's horses instead of just redistributing them, seems a little hard to believe, because you're kind of getting beyond the preventative justice retribution kind of space and more leaning into cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's hard to have a successful bison hunt without horses in reserve. Horses in these societies, in a lot of cases, functioned almost like currency. Wealth, in a lot of cases, was based on horses. So the idea of just killing them as a form of punishment instead of giving them to other people who could certainly use them, that seems a little rich. It also seems a little rich the speed with which the Axita would kill a person for resisting their tent being torn to pieces and their meat being taken and their hides being torn to pieces or burned or whatever. That also seems a bit rich because, again, these are societies where human beings aren't machinery or gears in an economy the way they are now, where today with industrialization, life is relatively cheap because we have machines do so much of what people used to do or could do. But with the Upper Missouri, pre-1854, every person, especially an able-bodied person who'd been on a hunt, it seems like killing that person would be an absolute last resort. Killing a person in that kind of economy, a hunting economy and a trading economy, it's almost like shutting down a power plant in modern society. Things go dark when you shut down a power plant. Society ceases to be able to function in a lot of ways when you lose power. And there's a very similar dynamic when you lose people in a society like the ones that hunted the buffalo in the mid-19th century. So we have to consider that maybe the author, who I believe is a military man as well, is maybe playing up the savagery a little bit. But at the same time, we don't want to wholesale dismiss this account because it seems pretty unlikely to me also that this observation is being made up out of whole cloth. Because if you were going to just make something up, wouldn't you make up something better than somebody just being tomahawked to death for resisting their punishment to taking too much meat? Wouldn't you add a little more flair? Wouldn't you add maybe some cannibalism? They ate this guy and then they fed his bones to his dogs and then they sacrificed his wife to the sun god. Wouldn't you go a little more nuts to try to sensationalize the story if you were just going to make stuff up? So again, I think here we have a skeleton of the truth, and we have a story being wrapped around something that definitely happened, but maybe not everything that's being told actually happened. Based on a true story, not necessarily a true story. The truth we can establish from what we read in this account is, number one, that these indigenous people had a mechanism for dealing with people who tried to do something that hurt the welfare of the entire group. We also see that this responsibility was invested in a specific group of people. It wasn't like a mob just went after these people and decided to rip up all their stuff, but there were people for whom this was a delegated responsibility. And to that end also, we remember in the quote that the Axita published and made clear what the rules of the hunt were and what the rules of distribution were. And so there was actually a codified law, for lack of a better term, or rule maybe, that was out there and that everyone saw, and everybody knew what the rules of the road were and knew what violations were and what was acceptable and what was not. These rules did not just exist in the mind of some popular person or headman or elder woman, but these were rules that were universally agreed upon in a functionally egalitarian society. There was a mechanism in place to make sure that the society could preserve itself and continue to exist, in spite of the fact that you are invariably going to wind up with bad actors. A society which, it is important to note, did not tolerate abuse. People engaging in selfish acts that put the rest of the group at risk were dealt with very quickly and somewhat severely. There was no investigating the community causes of this individual person's harm. It was snuff that harm out before it spreads like a disease. If you allow one person to take too much and to harm the group, then that can create a kind of scarcity where it makes another person believe, maybe I can get away with it. Maybe I can take 2 loins and backstraps instead of just 1, or maybe a half of 1. And if that person gets away with it, then maybe another person gets away with it, and so forth and so on, until eventually you wind up with actual scarcity. And now you have people who are being greedy, not because they're inherently greedy, but because everyone else is being greedy, and there is an actual lack of resources for everyone. So now instead of cooperating, people are competing to get theirs. It stands to reason that the Upper Missouri people that this account is written about maybe learned this the hard way. Maybe had some greedy people that took their societies to the brink of collapse, and they had to make the choice to change their society to be able to recover, and then endure after that recovery. After all, the indigenous people that in many ways we seek to emulate, they weren't plopped down on the earth in some state of cultural perfection. It stands to reason that indigenous people went through their own cultural evolution and had to figure out these codes and ways of working together in a cooperative and collective way through trial and error, by making mistakes, by figuring out what to do with people who, despite the fact that our human species could be rightly considered a naturally cooperative one, nevertheless, you have some actors who are going to be manipulative and try to aggrandize themselves using the productivity of the group to get themselves ahead rather than advance the collective good. Indigenous people had to figure out how to deal with that. And the way it was dealt with was with codes and rules and enforcement of those codes and rules, not mob justice, not popularity contests, and certainly not enabling and tolerating the behavior just as a fact of life that you had to deal with. Let us recognize that the modes of living sustainably that indigenous people adopted and that modern society wants to adopt from those indigenous people were not an outgrowth of some genetic predisposition to being quote-unquote better people than maybe other people are, but instead were the result of choices that people made. Sometimes difficult choices, painful choices, maybe to punish or expel people who otherwise they would love and had value and whose humanity was recognized, but nonetheless, decisions had to be made to value the life of the collective over the life of an individual, especially if that individual had decided to dedicate themselves to getting things at the expense of everyone else. Let us also recognize, though, another kind of complexity. A complexity born of the fact that even though these systems of justice existed with indigenous people, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were perfect all of the time. And when you look at the case of, say, someone who took too much meat on a hunt and was punished by the Axita, maybe that person would say, I was perfectly justified in taking too much on this hunt. Maybe on the last hunt, Johnny Her Many Horses got all of the loins off of that one bison, and all I got was shank, and there isn't enough juniper berries in the entire prairie to make a shank worthy of eating. And maybe one of the guys on the Exita would say, well, why didn't you bring that issue to the Exita the last time? And maybe the guy responds, well, I'd love to bring it to the Exita, but, you are Johnny Her Many Horses' uncle, and, you guys weren't going to listen to me no matter what. If we have indigenous people listening to this podcast, it wouldn't be at all beyond imagining that there would be corruption in how the structures of power operate. Indigenous people are no strangers to corrupt tribal politics. And while those things may be exacerbated by the state that we're in, given that we're living under colonialism and we are reaping the consequences thereof, it wouldn't have been completely new. Certainly it would have existed back then in the mid-19th century and would have existed before. It's, as the old saying goes, power corrupts. If you're going to have a group with any kind of endurance, then it has to have the ability to deal with disagreements and abuses that come up. And then someone or some ones have to be given the power to enforce the decisions of the group. Because if no one has that power, if no one has the ability to make sure that decisions are actually honored, then what you have is a group that will splinter and fragment and disappear the minute there is any real disagreement with anyone. American leftism has all kinds of problems, just like all social and political and economic movements have their problems. That's just part of the territory of trying things and being different. And we're going to talk about some, if not most of those, over the course of other podcasts. But this particular episode just shows one little nugget of the problem. Some, but by no means all, leftist movements, when it comes to deciding what the future social order will look like, they like to reach for inspiration to indigenous people, but in doing so get it very, very wrong and embrace a notion of Indianness that is more based on noble savage mythology than reality. And the reality is, these societies contained features that a lot of lefties would consider distasteful. Things like power and the ability to wield it, social hierarchy, delegated responsibility, consequences for abuse, personal property, private property, though not applied to land, wealth, global trade, even markets. All of these things existed within these societies that managed to live on the earth without depleting or destroying it. And the story you just heard was but one example of these things existing in that time. When we, as people on the political left, talk about creating new social structures that will endure after the fall of capitalism or whatever this revolutionary event it is that we think is coming, we have to figure out how do we reconcile the fact that our movement, for every one person who genuinely wants to create a care economy that ensures opportunity and equity and justice for every one of those people, we seem to attract two people who are simply rebellious and don't want to be told what to do under any circumstances. The lesson, at least from the indigenous people in the upper Missouri, appears to be that there is no reconciliation there. And the hard truth is that sometimes some people can't come with you. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something from this episode. Stay tuned for the next episode, which picks up where the book left off, going into details of how our farm made our marketing and sales work, and why the go-it-alone approach is so rarely successful for small farms. Learn more about our work at sylvanaqua.com, that's SYLVANAQUA.com, where you can buy the food that we grow if you are in the Washington, D.C., Richmond, Charlottesville, or Baltimore metropolitan areas, or where you can also help us get food to folks living under food apartheid and who've kind of been left behind and not really thought about by the farm-to-table movement by contributing to our mutual aid program, also on the website at sylvanaqua.com. So with that, La Pishkanewul, we'll see you next time.